Welcome, everyone. This is the Liberty Classroom course, History of Economic Thought, Part 1. I am your lecturer, Robert Murphy, and we're now on Lecture 5, dealing with the celebrated and justly famous David Hume. So we're going to be just giving a brief overview of Hume and then diving into his economic writings in this lecture. All right, David Hume lived from 1711 to 1776. Just some brief biographical remarks. He was a Scottish philosopher, economist, and historian. He's a giant in what we could call the Scottish Enlightenment. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of David Hume. It's funny, I was reading Lionel Robbins' lecture to his History of Economic Thought class, and when he got to Hume, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he said something along the lines to the students, if you guys don't know who David Hume is, I really can't help you at this point in your career, your academic career. You have to know who David Hume is. How could you not know? And he kind of moved on. I'm going to give you guys a little bit more of that because I'm a much fairer lecturer than Lionel Robbins. I'm more merciful. Okay, so Hume was born in Edinburgh. His father was a Scottish lord, and he studied on the continent. And some of his major works include A Treatise of Human Nature, which was published 1739 to 40, Political Discourses, 1752, and a famous 6-volume History of England that was released in terms of the volumes over the period 1754 through 61. Let me take a moment to make sure there's no confusion. I want to talk about the placement of David Hume in this Liberty Classroom course that I'm offering for you guys. So, generally speaking, the order of the people we cover is chronological. However, remember last lecture we dealt with Francois Cunet and Turgot. So Cunet's major work came out in 1758. Turgot's was 1766, while Hume's economic essays are 1752. Okay, so again, what we're going to cover today from Hume actually was published earlier than the major works we covered last class from Cunet and Turgot. And in fact, Turgot was intimately familiar with Hume's work, so it's not just that this was published first, but Turgot was aware of it when he wrote his own work. And so why did I do that? Why didn't I put Hume before those two guys? Well, two things. We also, in last lecture, covered Bernoulli's solution to the St. Petersburg paradox, and that was published before Hume's work. So, strictly speaking, if we go by Bernoulli, then the material from last lecture was chronologically before. But more importantly, Hume is clearly the predecessor to Adam Smith. All right, and from the terms of the Scottish Enlightenment, and then you'll just see that the type of analysis that Hume does is clearly the forerunner to what we're going to study from The Wealth of Nations from Adam Smith, which is going to be, the future lectures from this point. So it just made sense. Whereas the French tradition, although there is some overlap, it's distinct. And so I just thought it would make more sense in terms of me organizing the material in this course that once we hit Hume, we go right into Smith. Okay, Hume's writings on philosophy. Let me talk a little bit about this before we get into the economics proper, because again, David Hume, the guy is a giant in terms of thinkers from this era. So here's a quote. "The public utility is the sole origin of justice, and reflections on the beneficial consequences of this virtue are the sole foundation of its merit." All right, so obviously that's a version of utilitarianism, but also more generally what could be called consequentialism. So not merely Benthamite utilitarianism, but also the value system officially espoused by Ludwig von Mises, and also Henry Hazlitt, certainly draws heavily on the writings of David Hume in this regard, in terms of ethics. Hume is also famous for arguing that you cannot derive an ought from an is. This is also referred to as the fact-value gap, or in economics, they often refer to it as a normative positive distinction. All right, so let me just make sure you understand what it is, what the claim is. So Hume was saying that, look, if you start out with a bunch of propositions about just facts about the world, objective facts of reality, there, is statements, the sun is hot, the diamond is a harder material than a feather, and so on and so forth. He's saying no matter how many of those propositions you take and string together, you're never going to get coming out of the other end of the pipeline an ought conclusion, right? So Hume argued you can't just list a bunch of objective facts about the world and then derive some sort of moral statement. So, this fact, this fact, this fact, therefore you shouldn't drown puppies or what have you, right? He was just saying there's no way to go from one type of statement to the other. And so, again, various ways of describing that are called a fact-value gap. That there's a gap between just starting with a bunch of facts and then trying to leap onto a value. Or you call it the is-ought distinction, that you can't go from a bunch of statements about what is and then derive a statement about what ought a person to do. In economic analysis nowadays, the terms we use are normative versus positive. And so normative would be something like the government should not impose a minimum wage law, whereas a positive economic statement is to say if the government imposes a minimum wage law, then the unemployment rate among unskilled teenagers will go up. Okay, so in that context, just to what Hume would be saying is you cannot merely state the sort of scientific argument or claim that imposing a minimum wage will make teenage unemployment rates go up and then derive from that the normative conclusion, therefore the government should not impose a minimum wage law. And why is that? Well, because, again, where are you getting that from? Now, what you could do, just to make sure you're not getting confused here, you could say, premise one, if the government imposes a minimum wage law, then teenage unskilled unemployment rate will go up. And premise two, it is bad or it is not a good thing, or the government should not take measures that increase unemployment rates among unskilled teenagers. And then if you have those two premises, then of course you can conclude the government should not impose the minimum wage hike. But you see there, the way I got that normative outcome was one of my premises had an ought built into it. All right, so that's what Hume's argument was. Now, by the way, don't just take that as dogma that, oh, yes, that's correct. So a lot of people to this day, especially a lot of economists, think this is obvious. They think Hume was brilliant for writing down this utterly true statement, whereas there are some people who dispute it. The philosopher Foote, for example, if you go look up Philippa Foote, is ought distinction or Hume's fact-value gap critique, you'll find all kinds of writings on that and discussion of it. All right, so again, I'm not telling you that this is correct. I'm just saying Hume is famous for this contribution to ethics theory. Okay, he also is famous for raising what is now referred to in the field of epistemology, meaning the study of how do we know anything, what's called the problem of induction. So here, Hume raised the issue, and he said, well, just because something has happened in the past, why does that make us think it's more likely to happen in the future? Right? So just because, if I pick up a ball and drop it, or let's say let go of it, and it always goes towards the floor, and I do it 1,000 times in a row, and it's been doing that as long as I can remember, we're all pretty confident that if I pick that ball up and hold it out at my chest length or chest height, arm's length, and then open up my hand, the ball's going to go down towards the floor. We're all utterly convinced of that. And yet, strictly speaking, why? Because it doesn't follow logically. We can't deduce that that's going to be the case. It's, and so philosophers of science in particular have spent careers since Hume raised this problem trying to solve it, because on the face of it, it looks like Hume just threw out empirical science. And yet Hume was a committed empiricist. All right, so again, I just want to make sure you're grasping what the nature of the problem is here. Hume is saying, look, at the whole success of the natural sciences rests on our belief that because we saw a pattern in the past, we think that that's going to continue in the future. I mean, if you think about it, that's what it means when we're looking for laws of nature. We're trying to say we can figure out what rules nature was obeying in the past, particularly under controlled experiments, then we think nature's going to keep following those laws in the future. But strictly speaking, why do we think that? How do we know? All right, so that's what the problem of induction is. So, as I say, many people revere Hume, and but I do want to mention Rothbard as a critic. I should probably also say at this point, in case I haven't said it already or don't say it in the future, let me just officially go on record and say, I'm guessing a lot of you who are motivated to go read the readings that I don't necessarily assign, but that I just mention, are probably going to get your hands on Rothbard's History of Economic Thought. Hopefully I'm whetting your appetite and you want to learn more. And by all means, Rothbard's treatment is wonderful, as he gives all sorts of fun anecdotes and things. It makes it very colorful besides just the economic analysis of the people involved. But you should be aware there are points where I think when somebody is really held up as a hero to the crowd, to the mainstream, that this is what the conventional wisdom says who a giant or a hero of thought is in this area. Rothbard really wants to make sure we don't give the guy a pass. Right? And so you're going to see, especially next time we'll talk about, as we cover Adam Smith, that Rothbard had a lot of negative things to say about Adam Smith. And so to understand the critical attention that Rothbard pays to Hume and to Smith, I think you need to understand it in light of the fact that typically free market people especially look back at Hume and Smith as heroes, and so Rothbard thinks that they're given too much credit. And so it's partly to restore the balance of justice. I think that Rothbard might be a bit harsh with these guys compared to what they really deserve. It's sort of like some people will tell you, oh yeah, the Beatles were terrible. Oh yeah, they're a terrible band. When really, I think what's going on is they're saying, I don't think the Beatles deserve the kudos and to be called the greatest rock and roll band of all time that others say, maybe I like the Rolling Stones more. And so the way that comes out is to say, oh yeah, the Beatles were terrible. All right, so just keep that in mind if you go and read Rothbard, that I think in his treatment of Hume and Smith, he sometimes was really just reacting to the laurels that others gave to these two thinkers that they probably did not deserve. So let me just read to you, for example, Rothbard's description of Hume. So here's Rothbard speaking. Hume's treatise, and he means Treatise of Human Nature, was pivotal in its corrosive and destructive skepticism, managing unfairly to discredit the philosophy of natural law, to create an artificial split between fact and value, and therefore to cripple the concept of natural rights on behalf of utilitarianism, and indeed to undermine the entire classical realist analysis of cause and effect. There is no figure more important than the unfortunate discrediting of the classical philosophical tradition of natural law realism, a tradition that had lasted from Plato and Aristotle at least through Aquinas and the late scholastics. In a sense, Hume completed the corrosive effect of the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes' influential view that only the precisely mathematical and analytic could provide certain knowledge. Hume's skeptical and shaky empiricism was the other side of the Cartesian coin. All right, so that's very strong a condemnation, But I just want to make sure you understand what's Rothbard reacting against, because as we've seen, there was this natural law tradition derived from Aristotle, and that was kept alive with the scholastics, and was very eloquently and beautifully stated in the writings of Aquinas, for example. And that was lost in terms of the going through the conventional mainstream philosophical traditions of the West. By the time you get to the 20th century, that's all gone. And it's to the point where people would ridicule that sort of argument as being medieval. And so Rothbard is exactly correct in saying that if you want to say what went wrong, if you think that that's correct, if you think you really can reason about the nature of man and the way the world works and come up with views about property rights and things like that, which of course Rothbard does. So there isn't, Rothbard thinks, an is-ought gap or a fact-value gap, right? Rothbard thinks you can, just from making scientific, if you will, observations about reality, derive normative conclusions. To say, you should not violate someone's property rights. And, and this is where, Rothbard later was so appreciative of the work of Hans Hoppe. All right, so then that's a different story, but I'm just placing the context here. So Rothbard does not agree with Hume's alleged contributions, or he thinks, Hume contributed to steering everybody off the right course that Aristotle and the scholastics had given us. All right, so so you can see here in his reference there to Descartes. I mean, Descartes famously said, "Hey, how can I know anything?" and just started going through and said, "Well, I think, therefore I am," and so it was extreme skepticism, and so Rothbard is saying that Hume took that approach, that attitude, into economics and political theory and basically social theory. Okay, so let's now go into Hume on economics. I've included here a picture. Let me just say, I mean, Hume is fun to read. All right, and I can remember partly why I included this image of the way these things look. If you get I think it's probably like the Liberty Fund version, where the text looks like the way it would have looked in Hume's day, with the funky S that looks like an F and that sort of thing. I mean, it's really fun to read, and it really puts you in the mindset of, oh wow, this is somebody from the past, a very powerful mind, and he's a very crisp, clear writer. So I've included some lengthy excerpts. If you're skipping around in this course and you don't have time to do all of the extra readings I assign, please click open my notes on David Hume, because I have long excerpts. You're really going to enjoy reading that, and you'll learn a lot. So even when you think that Hume is wrong on something, you will end up knowing more about the topic, just thinking through and putting your finger on, well, wait a minute, well, why do I think Hume is wrong here? Okay, so his the three essays we're going to cover on money, interest, and the balance of trade. And so I'm just going to read you some excerpts and then comment on them in the time we have left in this lecture. So, of money, here's Hume. If we consider any one kingdom by itself, it is evident that the greater or less plenty of money is of no consequence, since the prices of commodities are always proportioned to the plenty of money, and a crown in Harry VII's time served the same purpose as a pound does at present. All right, so what he's getting at there, that'd be like us in the United States saying, hey, this what you could buy with $1 today, a quarter could have done in the time of your parents when they were kids, right? So the point is that it's by increasing the amount of money in the economy, it doesn't make everybody richer. All it does is make prices rise. All right, so this is a very important insight from Hume, and even Rothbard in his own economic work would refer matter-of-factly to Hume's contribution in this regard, to say, Hume's insight that any amount of money can serve the purposes of money, right? So when you think about what is it that money does for us, as strictly as its role as a medium of exchange, right? So if the money's a commodity money like gold or silver that serve industrial or artistic purposes, right? You can take gold and make necklaces with it and so on, or do other sorts of industrial things with certain metals that might also serve as money. Well, then the more of those you have, the more you can do with the direct uses. But the point is, if you're just looking at whatever the good is that, or the commodity is that serves as money for a community in its role as the money, it doesn't matter how much of it you have. If you double the supply to a first approximation, all that means is that the prices of everything quoted in that double. So it's not that you make everybody richer. All right, so we continue now with Hume. It is of no manner of consequence with regard to the domestic happiness of a state, whether money be in a greater or less quantity. The good policy of the magistrate consists only in keeping it, if possible, still increasing, because by that means he keeps alive a spirit of industry in the nation and increases the stock of labor, in which consists all real power and riches. Okay, so here in the interest of brevity, I skipped some of the discussion and I went right for the punchline. If you open the notes I've given you for this course, you'll see the in-between part. So here it sounds like he's contradicting himself. Strictly speaking, I think he's wrong, but I don't think it's a contradiction. All right, what Hume is saying is that the level per se of the stock of money is irrelevant. Right? If we're just considering things in a static framework, we're just saying, hey, does it matter to the community whether we have 1,000 pounds of gold circulating or 10,000 pounds? No, it doesn't matter. But he does think there is a dynamic element involved, and that other things equal, if the quantity of money is increasing, then that promotes a spirit of industry. And he has a discussion about why that is that's very interesting, because it's similar to Cantillon's discussion, what we called Cantillon effects. But the conclusion Hume draws from it is arguably the opposite. So again, I go over this more carefully in the notes, but very briefly, excuse me, the point is that Hume is saying when new money enters the economy, it does get into certain people's hands first, and they can spend it before prices have generally risen in response. And so that gives certain people the ability to hire more workers, right? Because they can raise wages or whatever, and the workers are eager to take a job for those higher wages. And so there's just this period where certain projects can be started, certain things can happen when people early on get their hands on that new money, whereas once the money works its way through the system and all the prices have adjusted, now you're back to where you were originally. And so there's no spur to extra production or industry. Okay, so Hume is, again, let me just restate it. Hume is saying once everything has settled down, whether we have a certain amount of money or 20 times that is irrelevant, because all the prices just are proportionally higher. And so it's not that we're richer in real terms. However, during the transition period, so if we start with a certain level and then new money comes in, before things settle down in that final state, there actually is more production than there normally would be. And so that's the sense in which actually the community does benefit. It's not from the higher level, it's from the increase, if you get what I'm saying. So I put it in the notes. One way to really see this distinction, that the distinction between it's the rate of or it's the increase, not the higher level per se, is that if you had one economy that was originally identical to another one, except that the second one had 10 times as much money, so the first economy has 100 units of money, the second one has 1,000, and then the first economy quintuples the money, so now it's got 500, whereas the second economy cuts its money stock in half, so now it only has 500. Boom, at that, going to that transition point, they both end up with the same amount of money, 500 units. But the first economy, according to Hume's analysis, would be richer because it went from 100 to 500, so it was increasing, and that gave a spur to industry, whereas the other economy was suffering from deflation, that it went from 1,000 units down to 500, and so that, by the reverse process, made businesses lay people off and so on. All right, so that's what Hume is getting at in this statement. So he's saying it's not having more money per se which makes us wealthier, it's just during that transition process. So he's saying the goal of the magistrate is not, I mean, it does sound like it's contradictory, but it's really not. The goal of the magistrate is not that you want to have more money per se, it's just that do whatever you can so that as often as possible the level of the money stock is increasing. Now, we're going to see, if you're sticking with me through part 2 of this Liberty Classroom sequence on the history of economic thought, when we get to Robert Lucas, his Nobel Prize lecture, he would say all I basically did was formalize stuff that you can find back in Hume. Right? So the two threads here, the two insights, Hume is saying, number one, in the long run, money is neutral, that pumping more money in or sucking money out doesn't affect the real economic variables in the long run once all the disturbances have worked themselves out. But at the same time, in the short run, money is non-neutral, that there are real effects from changing the quantity of money. And so Lucas thinks that Hume, being the brilliant guy he was, observed this and wrote it out in words, whereas Lucas is just trying to come up with a formal model that obeys rational expectations to make those two things be true in the model. So again, if you stick with me, we'll study Lucas's model and see exactly how he did that. Okay, now we move on to Hume's essay Of Interest. So here's quoting from Hume. Were all the gold in England annihilated at once, and 1 in 20 shillings substituted in the place of every guinea, would money be more plentiful or interest lower? No, surely. We should only use silver instead of gold. No other difference would ever be observed, no alteration on commerce, manufactures, navigation, or interest, unless we imagine that the color of the metal is of any consequence. Okay, so here, again, he's saying, and this is a little trickier to see, so I'll walk you through it, but he's saying, in the long run, once everything adjusts, the stock of money does not affect the rate of interest. So, for example, if you double the quantity of money, once everything settles down, the nominal rate of interest, right, the actual market rate charged on loans of money, we wouldn't expect it to be higher or lower than it was before we did that experiment. So, at first, this seems a little strange because here's the idea, or where you might be getting confused, and this is when I first read Hume's essay. I had to walk through this myself back when I was a young lad. So imagine right now that there's a 1,000 units of money and the rate of interest is 10%, and now we double everything. All right, so now there's 2,000 units of money. So what used to cost $10 now costs $20. What used to cost $100 now costs $200, and so on. So you might think, oh, wait a minute, well, before if the interest rate was 10%, now it should double to be 20%, right? Well, no, because interest, you're not buying goods with an interest. Interest is a percentage. It's saying how much does present dollars trade for future dollars. So strictly speaking, one way of thinking of it is to say if the interest rate is 10%, that means $1 today buys you $1.10 12 months from now. That's one way of thinking about what does the interest rate mean. And so it's, if you were thinking before, I wanted to borrow $100 today to buy something, and then next year I would pay $110, to the lender to extinguish the loan. And now, oh my goodness, we double the money stock, so all the prices double. Well, okay, then what that would mean is you pay $200 today for whatever the thing was, TV or something, and you borrow the $200, and then next year you'd pay what? You would pay $220 back. Right? The amount you paid would double. But you see there, if you're paying $220 back, the interest on the loan is $20. So yes, the payment of interest has doubled. It's $20 instead of $10 in the original scenario. But notice the percentage is still 10%. That the percentage by which the principal balance increased over the course of the year is only 10% of the original principal. All right, so the rate of interest is still 10%. Another way of seeing it is, yes, you're paying more for goods because the purchasing power of money has gotten cut in half, if you will, but what you're obtaining when you borrow money is money. And so it's like the two things cancel out, that the dollars you're using are weaker, but what you're buying is also money, which is weaker. And so the two forces cancel out, right? So I hope I'm at least getting the point across to you. You can go look in the notes if I've lost you with that quick verbal explanation. I type it up more formally in the notes. So the important point, though, is Hume is saying it's actually what he's trying to warn against here is the opposite intuition. A lot of people thought when money increases, that pushes down the rate of interest, and he was saying, no, it's not obvious. Why would that happen? Okay. The next passage from Hume we're going to cover on this topic. Those who have asserted that the plenty of money was the cause of low interest seem to have taken a collateral effect for a cause, since the same industry which sinks the interest commonly acquires great abundance of the precious metals. A variety of fine manufactures with vigilant enterprising merchants will soon draw money to a state if it be anywhere to be found in the world. Okay, so here, again, very clever, logical, sharp thinker, Hume is saying there's this popular notion that if the quantity of money goes up, that pushes down the rate of interest. And he's already gone, through reasoning to say that doesn't make sense. That how can that be? And he says really what's going on is that it's a correlation in the real world. So yes, it's understandable why people think, why they associate an increase in the stock of money with a low rate of interest, because the two often do go hand in hand. But he's saying really what's going on is the same cause is producing both an influx of money and a reduction in the rate of interest. He's saying in particular, if there's an area that has a lot of industry and production and growing wealth, then they tend to attract money from the neighboring regions, and that also depresses the interest rate because now there's more capital, there's more wealth available to be lent. All right, so I'm paraphrasing, but that's the idea. So if you want to go see his specific analysis, again, just click on the notes. Okay, now a very important contribution from Hume is his thoughts on international trade. So here we'll read from him. But there still prevails, even in nations well acquainted with commerce, a strong jealousy with regard to the balance of trade and a fear that all their gold and silver may be leaving them. This seems to me, almost in every case, a groundless apprehension, and I should as soon dread that all our springs and rivers should be exhausted as that money should abandon a kingdom where there are people and industry. Okay, so again, just to make sure you're understanding his language, he's saying, he can't understand it. There are even his acquaintances and his contemporaries who have studied commerce, yet they somehow are afraid, if we don't have the right government policies in place and we don't maintain a, quote, favorable balance of trade, meaning that we're exporting more goods and services to foreigners than vice versa, so that money is flowing into the country on net, that people are worried, if we don't watch out and when we have an unfavorable balance of trade where we're buying more stuff from foreigners than vice versa, then all the money's going to flow out of our borders and we're going to have no money. And Hume is saying that's as silly as worrying that, if we don't build dams and so on, that we're going to run out of water, that all of our springs and rivers should just take all the water out of our nation so we're left with nothing. Okay, so here's a really famous passage. This is Hume. Suppose 4/5 of all the money in Great Britain to be annihilated in one night, and the nation reduced to the same condition with regard to specie as in the reigns of the Harrys and Edwards, what would be the consequence? By the way, that term specie there means like the hard commodity money, so not paper money. So in economics, especially when we're dealing with these older thinkers and writers, the term specie, again, means like the coin. So he's saying, suppose 4/5 of all the money were annihilated in one night, and so now all of a sudden Great Britain has as much coin as it did way back in the day of the Harrys and the Edwards. Must not the price of all labor and commodities sink in proportion, and everything be sold as cheap as they were in those ages? What nation could then dispute with us in any foreign market, or pretend to navigate or to sell manufactures at the same price, which to us would afford sufficient profit? And how little time, therefore, must this bring back the money which we had lost, and raise us to the level of all the neighboring nations? All right, so that's a critical passage. What this is Hume there was just describing what we now refer to as his price-specie flow mechanism, which showed how a trade deficit would eventually reverse itself. Right, so the big picture here is to say these mercantilist fears were baseless. You don't have to have government bureaucrats painstakingly watching trade flows to make sure the country doesn't run out of money. All right, and again, the reason is, as he eloquently put it in that last passage, but let me put it in language more familiar to you. The idea is this: if the country for a while is running a trade deficit, meaning our people are spending more money on things that foreigners make than vice versa, well, then that means, and let's suppose right now the world just uses gold coins. All right, so everybody uses gold coins as money, just to keep it simple. You can extend the analysis to modern day fiat currencies where we Americans use dollars and people in Europe use euros and so on, but it's easier to picture it physically if we're actually picturing yellow coins that are in people's pockets. All right, so right now our nation has 1,000 yellow coins and our neighbors have 1,000, and then for whatever reason our consumers want to buy stuff from foreigners more than the foreigners want to buy stuff from us. So what does that mean? Well, it means that on net, gold coins are flowing out of our country. All right, so let's say it gets to the point where we only have 100 gold coins left, and the neighboring nations now have 1,900, right? Because they had their original 1,000, and then 900 on net flowed out of our country into the pockets of people who live in surrounding countries. All right, so Hume is saying that process is going to naturally reverse itself. We don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, we're going to run out of money if we don't do something, because now that there's only 100 gold coins in our country, what's that going to do to prices? Well, clearly prices are going to have to fall, and wage rates and so on, because now there's not that much money in people's possession, so they can't spend as much domestically. So domestic prices and wages fall. And so eventually foreigners are going to realize they can buy things from us much more cheaply than they can from their own producers. And by the same token, and the opposite is happening abroad, that now that they have 1,900 gold coins floating around instead of the original 1,000, prices there are going to go way up. And so people, foreigners are going to find our goods much more attractive at some point. And then the trade deficit will reverse itself, that our people will tend to spend locally or buy locally because it's cheaper, quoted in gold coins, and foreigners also will realize, instead of buying stuff from our people, why don't we buy it from this other nation that before we didn't like so much because we thought their products were too expensive. Now they're pretty cheap, and so that means we're going to have a trade surplus, and so on net, gold coins are going to flow back into our country. So to relate it to what Hume was saying, he was just saying, imagine if somehow when we just woke up one day, all of a sudden 4/5 of all the money in Great Britain is gone, and just during the night somehow it disappeared. He's saying there it would naturally be replenished, that all of us, our prices would drop drastically, then we would be running a huge trade surplus for a while, and then money on net would flow into Great Britain until our prices started rising and other nations' prices fell. All right, so that was the thought experiment that he went through. Okay, so again, that's the price specie flow mechanism, and it is a very crucial intellectual argument to realize that at least the crude versions of mercantilism are completely baseless, that you don't need to worry about all the money flowing out of your country because of trade deficits that would set in motion forces that would reverse it. Okay, so that ends our discussion of David Hume, and next time we will start discussing the celebrated alleged father of economics, though not in Rothbard's view, Adam Smith. See you soon.